everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. Thank you always for tuning in and listening to the courageous stories that our guests bring each and every week to hopefully spark some hope in any of you that are out there that are really needing a dose of hope, inspiration, whether you are deep in grief or supporting people who are grieving. So welcome to the show. I want to introduce a very special guest this week. She's a little spitfire, and her name is Maya. And Maya is the owner and founder and CEO of her own company called MaYapinion. And she runs an event logistics company under her own name. And she also has two podcasts. One is MaYapinion, the leadership podcast for women. And the other, which is very relevant to this show, is the Surviving Siblings podcast. And Maya, we are going to be diving deep into her traumatic story of the loss of her brother. And I want to welcome you, Maya, to the show, and for all of the work that you're doing out there for those people who are deep in grief. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. I'm so thrilled to be here and be on the other side of the interview. It's exciting.
I know, right? I know. Well, I just want to let you know, I had said a little bit of this before we started recording, that I had an opportunity to listen to a few episodes of your really wonderful podcast that is dedicated specifically to surviving siblings. And as you know, of course, that I lost my brother too, which is the impetus for this podcast. I would really want you to tell the story of your brother. You can tell the parts that you feel are, to sort of like just give us that high level overview of your brother, what happened, and then we'll dive right into that process and where you are today. So please take it away.
Absolutely, Susan. Thank you for allowing me to share. As you said, of course, yes, I have the podcast if you want to listen to the very, very detailed version on season 1. But I lost my brother, Andreas. I think it's really important to say their name, right? It's really important to remember them. I lost Andreas in November of 2016 to a homicide. I'm here in Atlanta, Georgia, so some of you guys may recognize when I talk about certain things. It definitely is and was the most traumatic thing that I've been through. And I think, for any sibling that goes through that, it is the most traumatizing thing that you can go through, especially something like a homicide or a suicide or, fill in the blank, something that's very sudden. So yeah, he was shot on November 19th, and he was declared officially, dead on November 21st of 2016. It was a very difficult, complicated situation. I don't like to use this term, gentleman was used that shot him. I would say men, boys that shot him, he knew, which was a very heart-wrenching and difficult situation for me.
Maya, before you delve into some of the details, yeah. How old was your brother? Because you guys were 3 years apart, right?
Sure. Yeah. My brother was 27 when he was shot and died, obviously, and I was 30. We had both just turned that. We actually share, so fun fact, we actually share the same birthday, September 21st, exactly 3 years apart. So which is
crazy.
It's really crazy. We always had like this really special bond. I'm going to get crazier, Susan. So here's the deal. So I was born in 86, and he comes along 3 years later. He had the same due date as me. He was 2 weeks late, was born on the same day, right? Obviously same birthday. And we weighed the same. Okay. So my mom always used to say that we were twins. He just came a little late. So
I remember you saying that in the podcast, because I mean, yeah. Seriously, what are the chances of being born on the same day as your sibling?
Yeah, it's out there, and I've gotten some messages from the show and people writing in, on our social media, our website, and there are some people where it's happened. But what's so interesting about our story is like, we had the same due date. We were 2 weeks late. We weighed the same. So I really do believe my mother in the sense that, a mother does know, right? And when she said that, we had so many things in common in our personalities and stuff. Yeah, we had a special bond for sure.
So tell us a little bit, before we talk about the horrific circumstances around his death, what was your relationship like with your brother? Bring him alive for us, because it sounds like you guys were very close. You had a special bond. Did you live near each other in proximity?
Yeah, so this is something that I think is really important to share and really important to be honest about and open about. And I've found that this has been helpful for a lot of siblings that have a lot of regret about, like, you know, homicide, suicide, accidents, things like that. And they regret the last thing they said to their sibling. And I say that to say that, well, my brother and I grew up and we were very close growing up. And I had this soulmate bond with my brother, and I still feel it. And I know we'll probably get there as my story goes on. My brother and I hadn't spoken for quite some time when he passed. And that was something I really had to work through. My brother and I were the only ones in the family that were still living in Atlanta. I'm the oldest of 4. So it's me, and then I have a sister, and then my brother 3 years, and then I have a sister who's 10 years younger than me. And so, you know, it was, he struggled. And I think that was a really freeing thing for me to be open and honest about as well on the show, and also talking to you, Susan, and talking to all of you about it, because I don't think there's any shame in being honest about the good, the bad, the ugly, the sad, all of it. This is a real person, right, that lived a life. And, you know, my brother struggled with drugs and alcohol. He struggled with different aspects of his life, and he was going through that. He was really going through that at the time, and wasn't in deep contact with most of us. And what's really eerie, I think, about the situation is the night before his passing, I was sitting across the table from, I'll tell this and then I'll go back into our relationship a little bit, but I was sitting across the table from my then boyfriend. It's not who I ended up marrying, but he happened to have the same birthday as my brother and I. Weird. I know, it was very weird. And I'll never forget looking at him saying, I need to call my brother. I don't know why, but I need to call my brother. I feel it. I need to check on him. It had been some time. And when I say some time, guys, it had been like a year or so. It had been a while.
I was going to ask you, and I want to interject for a second, because a lot of people, I think listeners, have read my book and know that one of the most difficult parts of grief are exactly what you're talking about. It's the guilt. Not everybody carries guilt, but I carried tremendous guilt. I also had a falling out with my own brother and hadn't talked to him in months. And the heartache of that guilt can complicate grief in a way that is difficult for people to understand who don't carry any. So I deeply appreciate you saying that, because I think that that can really prolong the agony of our grief.
Oh, absolutely. I agree completely. And that's why it was so important for me to share in conversations like this, but also in my own show. Just, I wanted to be in a place where I could be completely honest and open, because that's how you really are able to help people, just so they know, like, this is not an only you thing. Like, this happens for other people. And it was very eerie because obviously we all know what happened. That was on the 18th. We all know what happened the next day. But to go back in time, you know, my brother and I, we were like inseparable. I was a tomboy growing up, and it was really the 3 of us growing up together, me and my sister and my brother, because my youngest sister didn't come along until 7 years after my brother, right? So my brother and I were really, really close all of my childhood, and even going into my teen years, because we were both very rebellious. So we worked all of that through. And, you know, it was really, again, it was just a relationship that's kind of indescribable. And we had this connection that I do think is exceptionally spiritual. And I feel like that's why I have gone on this mission to share in this journey to help others. And I know what it feels like to lose a part of yourself. And that's really what it felt like that day. It was a lot for me. But I think it's important for everyone to know, just like you're saying, Susan, you know, it's hard. You do carry that with you, the guilt, the shame, whatever emotion you're going through, or like, oh my gosh, wish I didn't say that the last time I saw them, or oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't speak to them for a couple months, or oh my gosh, I wish I didn't judge them for that. But releasing that and doing that in whatever form that works for you, that's been a game changer for me. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But that's
no, and it's okay, because I think that, you know, one of the things that I write about, I talk to siblings from all over the world, as you know, because you're reading the book, that the thing that people don't talk about often in grief is we have our own personal journey, and then we have the very complex and complicated relationships with family members. And so grief, I just see it when I see grief in the center, and it just kind of mushrooms out, and beautiful things can happen during that process. And then a lot of there's a lot of pain that happens in that process. We can cut people out of our lives. It impacts friendships. And I think that what struck me in listening to the first couple of episodes where it's you solo really telling us your story was I could feel in your story the complexity of trying to be there in your brother's final hours and him dying in this most tragic, horrific way, but also you being the eldest. Your parents were not together at the time. And it just, for me, it felt like you were this young person holding the weight of the world on your shoulders. I could cry right now. I probably will. I usually do during these conversations, and also trying to be present for the final hours of your brother's passing and trying to digest what was even happening, because the trauma of that alone, just the trauma of the way he died would have been enough, but you were holding a million things at the same time. So I know that we were talking about the relationship with your brother, and I know that you said you hadn't talked to him for a year, but your relationship prior to that, before he started getting, straying, as I like to say about my own brother, right? And like doing their thing, that the two of you had this bond. What was going on for you this year that you weren't talking to him? Were you angry at him? Was he not returning calls? Like, what was happening? Or were you just off living your own lives? I mean, he was 27, you were 30.
Great question. So it had gone on for a couple years, unfortunately, with my brother, and it had been, I should say, had been going on for several years, my brother's battle with drugs and alcohol, right? And so that was challenging, and it had gone on since high school. So he had this decade-long plus battle with drugs, alcohol. And again, that's why I think it's so important just to be open and honest, and you have to get to a place where you're ready to talk about those things. And I'm in your book reading about that, and you know what it's like to be open and honest about that, about your brother, and or if you guys have lost your sister, right? It's not easy to get to that place where you're open about it, but that's what was going on with him. It was a decade-long battle, and sometimes you have to distance yourself from someone like that, because it's in our family. It's not something that's it's around, it's an issue. And I use this quote often, Truman Capote. I'm an English major. I know you are too. I know, Susan. But I use this quote from Truman Capote a lot. He's one of my favorite writers of all time. And it's from In Cold Blood, which seems kind of dark in this circumstance. But he talks about when he was writing that book, and people were so fascinated. They're like, how can you connect with someone who killed people or things like that? And he would always say, look, we lived a very similar life. And this is how I describe my brother and I just went out the front door and he went out the back door. And that's exactly how I describe, like, this makes me emotional because you got it out of me, Susan. Okay, you made me emotional. But that's exactly how I describe my brother and myself, because my brother chose to do some things that put him in really risky situations. Not that anything that happened to him is his fault, but he was a risk taker, and that in some ways that was great. And I tried to captivate a lot of that in the things that I do. And I really don't care what people think about me anymore. And that's from his spirit. I harness that from his spirit. And I get that from your book too. And I love that. But, going out the front door for me was really taking a lot of the pain and making it purpose. And that was from other elements of our childhood and our life. And I really felt like my brother was in pain. And so, that's a long answer to say, there had been separation. There were periods of time, unfortunately, just because he was really struggling, and he didn't, he wasn't open to help for several different reasons. So that was the struggle, unfortunately, but it does not mean that the love and support wasn't there.
Oh, of course. I mean, and I think that is the deepest misnomer, that the guilt that we carry of what we could have done, of what we should have done. And I work with clients that they've lost children. I mean, I've worked with some people who have had just profound trauma. And, even as human beings, we are not the sum total of our worst mistake. And I love that you bring up Cold Blood, because I've done a ton of volunteer work in the juvenile detention facilities and also in the adult facilities. And it's forgiveness what forgiveness of self looks like, regardless of what we have done in the world, ties into that guilt that we can feel when we lose a loved one, because the very first thing we do is self-attack around what I could have done, what I should have done, did I do enough, etc. We all know the couldas and wouldas and shouldas. My question to you is, after the loss of your brother and you were there, and I would like for you to talk about as much or as little about that particular piece as you want, but what that healing was like for you, given where you were with your brother at the time of his death. Did you hang on to this guilt? How did you deal with your guilt? Talk to us a little bit about that process, and also in anything else, as I said, that you want to talk about during that horrific time of his death.
What a great question, Susan. Oh my gosh. I don't know that anyone's ever asked me that, and I've done a lot of these interviews about this. Great question. So I think one of the ways that I worked through kind of the guilt of that, I mean, earlier you completely described what I was going through beautifully. I don't know if I could have described it that well, about the weight of the world being on me, because yes, I am the oldest. I'm the one living here. I was the one who had to make the calls about do not resuscitate, do resuscitate, all of those things. It was a lot. I'm the one who had to make the phone calls. It was a lot. My mother was the one who called me, but I'm boots on the ground here, as they say, right? So for me, I think, and if you guys listen to the story, but I'll tell you the 50,000 foot part of this now, as we say, I think how I worked through the guilt, or the fact that 24 hours before I was telling my then boyfriend I need to call my brother, which is so wild, and how connected we were. And he was hanging around with these guys that ended up killing him. So I was feeling this energy. I totally believe in that. And I did not leave his side. I would not leave his body. I would not leave his side, because when he came in, there was no way he was coming out. Like, he was not alive. I mean, he was alive, but he wasn't alive, right? I mean, they kept him on life support so that my family could get there, but he wasn't talking, he wasn't speaking, and you guys will hear that in my story. But I think that was my immediate fix, I guess is the best way to say it, Susan, is I slept on his body. I brushed his hair and cleaned him and washed his face so my dad wouldn't see him a certain way. And I was trying to, regardless of my very complicated relationships with each one of my family members, I didn't want them to see what I saw. And so that was some of the things that I was doing to work through that. I was like, well, at least I can protect my sisters from this, or at least I can protect my mom from this, or my dad from seeing this, and then I was the last one to leave the room. I didn't want to leave his body, which this makes me very emotional, but that was the immediate way. And then doing things. So I adopted a dog that was huge. I already had one dog, but this little Chihuahua was jumping up at me, and I was had no intention of adopting a dog, and I adopt this dog, and my brother's girlfriend ends up freaking out because I posted it on social media, and I'm like, why are you freaking out? She's like, because Andreas, my brother, wanted a Chihuahua for the past year and never got one. Mind blown. She's the sweetest dog in the world too, sweetest dog. So that was wild. That happened just days after. Yeah. And then, I got a tattoo. I said I'd never get tattoos. I got a tattoo of his dates and stuff. There were just things I was trying to do to keep him remembered and alive. And I think those were my immediate things to kind of work through the guilt and work through the pain. And it was really, the first year I was really numb too, to the whole situation. And then I went on a mission. I wanted to solve this. I was going to get justice for him. So it went from doing those milestone things into justice mode, and private investigators and calling the detectives, which I talk about on, the show again in more detail. But that was kind of the process for me. And that was tough because I ended up getting stuck in anger in that phase. Once I came out of the fog, I got stuck in anger. So that's hopefully that kind of answers your question there, Susan, but that was a tough part.
Okay, this is perfect. I got two things to say, because
sure.
I have to just because I also got a tattoo. Never thought I'd get a tattoo in my entire life. And the dragonfly is something was very important to my brother and I. And so I got a tattoo with his name in the wing. And then when I put my golden retriever down, I decided on a small dog, and I went to the website, and the dog's name was Rocky, with my and he was born on my brother's birthday, and I bought him, and that's who I have with me, Rocky. That's bizarre. Anyway, listeners,
Love
that's
it.
a side note. Okay, let's talk about this idea of justice. And so so now what you're describing are things that you did. These are very tangible things that we can do to keep the memory of our loved one alive. It's interesting because at the time I was seeing a grief and loss therapist, I saw for a year, and she did energy work, and she told me the anger would come, and I'm like, oh, I'm not angry. I was so pissed. And when that anger came, I wasn't expecting the anger though. So it sort of came, and I'm like, what is this thing taking over my body? I felt possessed a little bit. I would scream. I was like, I'm having a breakdown. Maybe I'm having a breakdown. I mean, I just didn't know what was going on. And I think anger still feels it's another layer before we get to that next layer where we can really allow the deep sadness to just sort of emanate from our pores. Talk to us about the anger when your brother was murdered. So murder brings anger to a whole other level. I interviewed people who had siblings that were murdered, and that level of anger can feed people for quite some time, right? Really, I think, can also delay that sadness that feels like it's eating your heart from the inside out. Talk to us about your anger. You sought justice, but I thought you knew who actually shot your brother. Did you not know that for a while?
So I do know who it is. I don't know him as a person. I know it is. And it was very complicated because, so I'll answer that and then I'll go into my anger. But so, yes, I know who the person is. It's very difficult because there's actually video footage of it on his Facebook, like page and everything, like up until an hour before it happened. It's very traumatizing and something I had to work through a lot in different capacities. But there's a whole investigation that happens, and is it an accident? Is it not? And like all these different things. And, I'm in Atlanta. There are shootings here every single night. What's prioritized, what's not. Mm-hmm. Is an quote unquote accident going to be prioritized? You know what I mean? Like, and then you've got multiple guys trying to cover. I mean, it's a lot to unpack. So you have to advocate. And I talk a lot about this when not necessarily on the podcast, but when I do a homicide episode with someone, which is not all the time. I try to not do those because not everybody goes through homicide, right? But when I'm on like TikTok live or whatever, and people ask me about this and they're like, I feel like the cops aren't there for me, or like, well, it's not that they're your enemy. It's the fact that they've got 50 cases that just came across their table today, and it just is what it is, right? So
and let's talk about the unspoken,
right.
That, like, you know what I'm going to say, right? You know exactly where I'm going to go. And, so we have the blaming, right? Like, oh, they were in with a bad group of people, get what they deserve. I'm not saying all cops feel that way, but there's an element to it. Exactly.
There absolutely is. And there absolutely was in my brother's case. And I can say that now. And that's one of the reasons it took me so long to do the show and do the podcast and talk about it publicly. And it was an open case. So I couldn't talk about it for, 2+ years too. So there's a lot of different components to it. But I got really angry. So that's all there. But the anger part for me, the first year, I like to call it the fog. That's just my terminology, because it's like, what is even happening? What just happened? Like, especially for sudden loss, I don't like to diminish any kind of grief or put one higher than the other. But I just have found that people, when I'm around them, when it's sudden loss, it's the denial or the shock that happens for people, it lasts a lot longer. And that's where I was. And then once I came out of that, I went straight to anger. Like, it was like you said, like a possession. I was like, and I fueled that into getting justice for him, the detectives, talking to them, doing all of those things, but also you can't really advocate much when there's an open case, right? So I felt my anger was frustration. My anger was like, how can this happen? I was getting messages, like cryptic messages from people telling me stuff that they knew, but then they would like delete their Instagram account or delete their Facebook account. So like, people knew that this was going on. People knew that these were bad people. They were telling me things like they warned my brother not to be around them. They were like, your brother had such a good heart. He trusted, like, it was it was messing with me. And so I was in anger. So what was I doing? Getting more angry. And so, I mean, I didn't know about support groups or anything like that. And I wish I did at the time because, I'm such an extroverted person. I think that would have helped me, but I thank God had therapy and thank God had, I lost quite a bit of friends, like you said earlier in the episode. It does happen, not because of my anger, because they didn't understand. But I had a really close friend. She's still one of my best friends. She lost her mother around the same time. She lost her 2 weeks before I lost my brother. She was going through a lot of the same emotions. And so thank God I had her. I don't think I would have made it without her. And I had another friend that really understood my loss. And without that, I wouldn't have made it to the other side of this. And so I allowed my anger to fuel me in both positive and negative ways. And so I really try to tell people to try to allow it to fuel you in a more positive way than negative. I mean, I definitely, and I admit this on my show, and I admit this very openly, the positive was getting justice for my brother, right? The positive was, doing things to advocate for siblings as much as I could at the time, and now more, right? The positive was, trying to not giving up, all of those things. The negative was drinking more than I should have, trying to escape, not really dealing with some of it, even though I was doing therapy. Sometimes I was like, oh, it's not, I can't do this. And I would kind of check out, and it wasn't as committed as I got to later, right? When I was like, this can't really take over my entire life, right? So anger was hard for me. That was the hardest one. And I find that everybody's a little bit different, but for me, I noticed it was getting really, really bad. And so
how did you notice? So this is key right now, where I want to enter into now, because my listeners know that, we don't need to pathologize grieving. We lose somebody, it's sad as hell, we cry, and it can take a really long time to feel like the shade has lifted on the sun. Then there's times when we can get a little bit in trouble, right? And this is what I say to people. It's a fine line. And this happened to me when I realized I actually need help. Maybe it helps that I'm a therapist and I believe in therapy and it was easy for me, but I couldn't do anything for a long time because shock, fog brain, whatever you want to call it. I flew over to Asia. I was over there for several weeks. I mean, there was a lot there's a lot that takes up our time. Anger takes up quite a substantial amount of our time too, I might add. How did you know? Sometimes it's a moment that a light goes on. Other times it's not. Other times it's people in our life saying, hey, you need to go get help. How did you know when it was time for you? Because I also was drinking way too much. I was hiding it from my husband. I wasn't suicidal. I tell people this all the time because I think that I wasn't suicidal, but I didn't want to live anymore. That can sound very confusing to people, but it's just true.
I understand completely. I was that too.
Right. You can hold both at the same time. What was the moment, or what got you to the point where you're like, yeah, I need something outside of myself to help me get through this?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. So there were a couple different moments together. One was a moment similar to what you're talking about right now. I really didn't think I could do it anymore. I just didn't. That makes me emotional still. And I think that's why I do connect with quite a few of the people that have come to me and talked to me about suicide, and things like that, because I just was at that point. And that scared me to death. That's where I was. And it got pretty close. And one of my friends saved me from it. That was one pivotal moment. Another pivotal.
Got close where you were thinking about ending your own life.
Oh, I attempted. Yeah.
You attempted to take your life. Okay.
And he stopped me.
I haven't gotten that far, I don't think, in your podcast. You must talk about this, right?
I do talk about it. I don't know how detailed I go, because this in season 3, that comes out March 15th, we're talking more about suicide. And so I'll be sharing a little bit more about my journey with that. But thank God I don't have a full journey with that. And I'm here today with you. But that scared me to death. That, like, I guess no pun intended, but yeah, that was a freaky one. Another freaky moment, that was not the final one though, because I did keep the drinking happening, because to add more stuff onto the table, I was on a reality show when my brother was murdered. So I had to go through this publicly on top of everything else. So that was really traumatizing because I could not talk about it, but people knew like something was not right with me at the situation. So when the show aired in April of like 2017, I think it was, I was going to like these parties, like watch parties and stuff like that. It was a dating show. No, I did not marry the guy. So, it was really a difficult time. So there was a couple times when I went to some after parties and one of my friends was like, you're drinking a lot. Like, this is like to excess. And then I remember going into 2018, I remember getting really upset with one of my really close girlfriends. She's still a close girlfriend to this day. That's a friend that sticks by you. I didn't remember this 100%, but I like shoved her. I got physical with her, which is not me at all. And that's how angry I was. And this is someone who has stood by my side since high school. And I was like, that's it. Like, that's it. You need to deal with this crap, Maya. Like, you need to deal with this. I don't know what that is. So I started to be more, I started to like, I had been in therapy for a really long time. I've seen the same therapist for over a decade because
okay, that's important then. You were already seeing a therapist prior to your brother.
But I was not being, here's the key part though, Susan, I was not being consistent. Nothing in my life was consistent. I had left my job. I was working for startups, which turned out to be great because I'm an entrepreneur now. So that would turn out to be good. But at the time, I was probably not in the best place to be doing that because I needed consistency. Right. And like I needed just steady Eddie kind of stuff going on. We all know this going through grief. And I didn't realize that. I was like, let me go ahead and start my contracting business during this. Like, was I nuts? Yes, I was. I was going through grief, and I was angry. And so, I did exactly that. I went and I took a steady Eddie type of job. And I'm glad I did it because I ended up meeting my husband there. And then we both went off and started our own thing, both of us. So it all worked out. But there were certain steps I took. I took therapy more seriously, because I just thought, I done all this work. Like, what? No, this is a whole new ball game. Like, I just watched my brother die. This is serious. Okay. This is a whole other ball game. I got a steady Eddie job. No, and I was like, Maya, you're 30, 32 now, 31. Like, this is not forever. Just get something steady Eddie where you go in every day. You have to be there. Like, because I had worked remotely for so many years and had been kind of, even though working for Fortune 500s, like my own boss, no, I needed something to get me up every day, be accountable. And I had never really needed that before. And I did that for a year and that was enough. And that was it. So there were some steps I had to take so that I wasn't doing those things anymore. And that moved me. Now, was I still angry? I was, but I kind of shifted and there was a sadness. But I met my husband and then I was able to kind of finally confide and like the floodgates opened. I ended up showing him like videos of my brother when I knew this was like, kind of probably going to be the person I was, going to spend some serious time with, something like that. You never know what's going to happen in life, but I regret nothing. And I remember showing him, my brother was a musician. And I like to speak of him in the present tense. That's just me. But so that was the first time I watched any of his videos. It had been almost 2 years. And I watched all of them in one night with my now husband. And he just sat there with me. And we had a bottle of wine, not 12. We had a bottle of wine together. And I just cried. And that's when I really feel like I shifted. That was
there's so many beautiful, poignant things that you're saying right now. But I want to go back to when you were on the brink of despair and wanting to take your life.
Yeah.
Did you want to take your life because you couldn't deal with the pain anymore? Can you help me to understand what was at the base of that? If you remember, because sometimes it's an accumulation of things that we can't handle. But do you remember
Oh, I remember. Yeah, I remember. So and I'll be sharing this in detail as well. So you guys get a preview right here with Susan. So it's interesting because this was not really in my anger phase. This was early. This was very early. So my brother passed November 2016. This couldn't have been more than 3 months after he passed. It was pretty early on. I would say that kind of was the beginning rumblings of the anger, but I was in so much pain. I have such a I felt so abandoned by my family. Some of it was by choice, right? I didn't want to have a relationship with them. And that's a whole other, show probably. But, and I talk about that openly, obviously, but I felt really abandoned. I felt completely by myself. I felt like nobody understood me also, because even though I had these friends that had gone through loss or were going through loss with me, you expect to lose your parents. You don't, and I'm not diminishing my friend's grief at all. She knew she was going to lose her parents. Like, it was going to happen. It just unfortunately was a sudden loss. You don't expect to lose your 27-year-old brother. So, I felt so alone. And then I felt there was also this kind of doom coming up too, because the show was going to air as well. And I was like, oh my God, now I've got to deal with it all over again in a few months. So I remember feeling it was like a rush come over me. It was the first time I think I really, really felt anything since my brother died. So yeah, I was probably February, March-ish, that kind of time in 2017. And I couldn't take it anymore. I just couldn't take it anymore. And I'll forever be grateful to my friend who saved me from that and helped me produce my first podcast, in my opinion. So yeah, I'm forever grateful for him, but it was probably extremely traumatic for him to watch me be like that. But it was just a very overwhelming experience. So, if you are feeling like that, like, please don't give up. Like, I wish I knew that there were other people out there. And that's why I'm on such a mission to share my story and to really just humanize the experience. Like, yep, I drank too much. Yep, I didn't want to go on. Yep, I switched jobs a bunch. Yep, but I'm here to tell the story now. And there is another side to it, and you can have a successful, happy life afterwards. But yeah, it's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone. But that was really what I was going through. Yeah, it was just complete overwhelm.
And I think like going back to just the trauma of it all, but something else that you said that is a very common theme in grief is this sense of feeling deeply alone. And I think also that sibling loss, and I did a lot of interviews around this as well, that siblings are often the forgotten ones, because at least in my case, when you've got older siblings, they've got a life. Sometimes they've got a spouse and children, and then your own parents, and everybody is very concerned about, as they should be. But in that, I think siblings, the way I think about it and talk about it, is constantly swallowing our own grief, trying to be strong for everyone around us. Then you've got the complexity of friends who people say, I love you all out there, but people say the dumbest things, not because they don't want to be there for us. They simply don't know what to say. Not everybody can be in people's pain and just hold that space. So they say lots of things. We hear all the platitudes. Most of them are not helpful. They're trying to be, they want to join with us. So they're like, oh, I know what you mean. My 90-year-old grandmother died. And you're like, no, that's not the same thing. And then we get more pissed off, but all they're trying to do is join with us. And it can be a real horror show. But I feel like if we can take a few minutes, because I do think this is the area where people do not talk about, is this fallout with family. And I know that there was a moment when your brother was dying and one of your sisters did not want to go in there and say goodbye to him. And not everybody can do that. And I get that. And I also get the torture of you being like, this is your time to say goodbye. I mean, I don't need you to go into depth if you don't want to, but can you just talk to us kind of the fallout of what happened with your family? Because you were the first responder to your brother. You were the one that was there. You washed his hair. That is in my mind. Through my book that I also had to see my brother in the condition he was in over in Asia. And it still haunts me to this day. And I'm so grateful that my parents didn't have to see him. And so I understand, like, I was really joined with you when you were thinking, I can protect the people I love. The trauma has already happened to you. You're already there. You're already a mess, right? And what can I do to help alleviate some of that burden and pain for my parents to have to see their son this way?
Yeah.
So if you could just speak a little bit about the after effects and where you are now with your family.
That is a huge question, but I'll do my best to keep it short as possible. But let me go here. Okay. So, it's a work in progress still to this day, but let me work through it. So, yeah, I mean, as I said before, I'm the oldest of four. It's me, and then I have a sister who's approximately a year younger than me, and then my brother 3 years younger than me, exactly, as we know. And then I have a sister who's 10 years younger than me. And, as you mentioned, Susan, everybody dealt with this so differently. And, one particular sister, I'll be honest, my sisters do not like me talking about them a lot on the show, so I don't use their names, but it just is what it is. But it's a part of the story. And yes, she did not want to go in there. She actually left early. That was very difficult for me. We already had a very strained relationship. We've always had a very strained relationship. And I could not understand at the time. I could not understand that. I definitely could, because like you said so perfectly, I had the full picture. I saw everything. I saw him coming into the hospital. I saw him, I helped clean him. Like, this was a whole thing, right? So I'm like thinking, and this is a horrible way to think, and I've changed my perspective, which I will transition to in a second. But I was like thinking at the time, 6+ years ago, I was like, how dare you? Like, you get the easy part of this. Like, you get to go in there. He's washed up and all of that. Not that any of this is easy, but I was like, just hold his hand and like say goodbye to his physical body. Like, are you kidding me? That's what got me like disturbed with her, right? And so, my mom, yeah, that is a strained relationship too. My father was my rock really during that. And then, which is interesting because my father wasn't really around. So it's really interesting how the dynamics change, because he was not around during my childhood. And very interesting how things change and how death changes your family dynamics. Like, not just the kids, it changes everything. And then, my other sister was so young when it happened. And she's just now, again, I like to keep their privacy, but she's just now really going through her own grief journey. And I'm really proud of her for that. And so, I felt very alone because the family dynamics were so crazy, because my one sister didn't even stay till like the last time we got to see him, which I could not understand. Like, I was like, this is crazy. Like, I'll hold on to, I was like holding on to his foot, and my dad's like tearing me out of the room, right? And we're all a wreck in like different ways. And my mom's dealt with it in a really, in my opinion, I'm very open about this, I think a very dysfunctional way. She's chosen to just say, I'm at peace with it. I'm at peace with it. I'm at peace with it. I don't agree with it. And I was very angry and pissed about that for a long time, Susan, because I was like, she's not processing. And, I felt the same way about my other sister. Didn't really know where I sat with my other sister, because I just knew she was so young. And so it was a lot. And then when I started moving out of the anger phase, and my dad, mixed emotions there too. Like, he really kind of threw a lot of his efforts into me. And he was like, I'm concerned about you mentally, because he got it. Like, it clicked with him what I had seen. And he was like, oh my God, like, my 30-year-old daughter is going to be traumatized for life. Like, so he was like, do you need help? Do you need to go to like, so my dad's foreign. My dad's from Switzerland. So some of his terminology doesn't translate well. So he was calling it like rehabilitation. He meant intensive therapy and things like that, right? So we were getting in fights over stuff like that, but it turned out fine. But he was throwing his energy into me. So everybody was dealing with it in all these different ways. And as I moved out of my anger phase, when I went to my steady Eddie job and like went through, I started to reflect and realize, like, okay, wait a second, Maya, like, let's separate everybody for a second here. Like, I had this real big epiphany that like everybody grieves differently. And like, I don't know why I have to learn everything the hard way, Susan, but I do in life. It's like my lot in life. But relationship wise, I think I have to learn everything the hard way. So I came to like this acknowledgement, I guess is a better term than acceptance, because even though I don't accept the way that they are dealing with their grief, I acknowledge it, and that's their way. Like, I don't think every single way that they're dealing with grief is good or positive, right? Because I see some very toxic behaviors happening with my mother. I think avoidance, you can't escape grief. We talk about this all the time with group. We talk about this in therapy. Like, it catches up with you. Either you're going to deal with it now, you're going to deal with it in 10 years, 20 years. I mean, You've had
or it turns into something,
it
right?
manifests itself physically, emotionally,
Yes.
a habitual thing, like whatever it is. And so I just came to the acknowledgement of, if that's going to be their path, then that's going to be their path. And one of my sisters has chosen to be, she's in anger. She's definitely in anger. And I feel like my mother is not in full, like, I don't know if there's even been a process. And I have an exceptionally good relationship with my youngest sister, which has been wonderful and has been a journey. And I'm really proud of her. She's on her own grief journey though. And that's her story to tell when she's ready to tell it. And, with my dad, I needed some time to kind of process that. And what really brought my dad and I together is him and I were both calling the detective. We were the only two family members incessantly calling the detective. And when I found that out, as I share later in the podcast, they were like, you and this other guy just keep calling. I found out when I had another detective help me. I call him like Detective Wonderful and Detective Nice on the show because I can't reveal his name because he's actually really well known. If you've ever watched like First 48 and stuff, he's on that show. But he was like, yeah, I verified it's your dad. And so that was a game changer for me, that him and I were really using our grief in the same type of way. And I just decided to really shift everything and decide to acknowledge that that's how they're going to process this or not process this. And so I actually do a lot of talks now about that, how you can move forward together as a family from my experience, like what has worked, what hasn't worked, because I find that failure can be one of the best teachers. So yeah, that's
Well, and thank you for that, because I think that, something that is important for us all to remember, that the grieving doesn't stop with the loss. We grieve the end of friendships. We grieve the way our relationships with family members can change. There is a rippling effect, as I said earlier. And, the image that I always use is that grief breaks our heart wide open, and we can do this. We can close up. Some people get caught in anger, depression, anxiety, or we can bloom. And what I mean by that, because people will say, Susan, never losing anybody is a gift. And I said, that is true. My belief about life, though, is that, the cliches exist for a reason. There can't be rainbow without the rain. You can't. Grief and joy are wedded. And the grieving process, when we allow ourselves to truly lean into it and go with the flow of grief and feel it, it can do nothing but help us to bloom and to soften and to understand so much of what we get caught up in is an illusion and a waste of time, that there are only two emotions. There is love and there is fear, and we are always operating from one or the other. And in grief brings out all of our fears and our ego and our flaws and our anger and all of the ugly. And in that ugly is the truth of actually who we are as spiritual beings of love. And I think that I love what you said earlier, that it took you a while to learn that we all grieve differently, because loving ourselves through grief is what allows us to love others through grief who are doing it in their own way. And that is the messy, complex beauty of being alive. And where we land, we land. We cannot control anybody else's process, but we can learn how to love our own selves through our own messiness of being alive. I don't know how else to put it. And when we do that, we can extend that latitude and gratitude to those around us. So I just appreciate you. I appreciate your depth of authenticity and honesty that you share in your podcast and also here, because I think grief is one of those things where if we keep it all bottled up, it doesn't make the horrificness of what's happened true, But when
I agree. That was one of the biggest challenges for me, and why I struggled. One of the reasons I struggled so much for 5 years, right? I felt like it was bottled up. I wasn't putting, my pain into a purpose. I didn't realize that was what was holding me back. I just want to comment really quick on what you said, though, about how we operate out of love or fear. I found that to be so true.
Yeah.
So true. And I felt such a shift in myself, especially in year 4.5 to 5. And this is when I like started purchasing a bunch of books and knew I wanted to do something with my pain. And it really shifted my perspective about how I looked at my family even more, to kind of even close that out more for you, because I started to realize the reason that some people, and this hopefully is helpful for your listeners and anybody grieving, sometimes people are grieving or not grieving in a certain way because of it's fear. It's fear. And when I really was able to truly grieve and move forward, because I don't really believe in moving on, I believe in moving forward. They're always a part of you, whomever you've lost. When I was able to truly move forward and put my story out there exactly a year ago, this love that I have for myself now is something that I've never experienced in my life. And I thought at 30, I was like everything. I thought I was like, I love myself. I'm cute. I've got a cute little body. I've got my own little condo in the city. I've got this great corporate job. It was so flippin' superficial. I had no idea. What I have now, even though, I obviously have businesses and I'm happy with my success there, what I have now is so much deeper, so much, I would, if I could get my brother back and trade it all, of course, just like you said, I would do that. But it's about, like you said beautifully, the blooming that comes out of, the darkness. And, you can't have a rainbow without rain, and all of that you said.
All of the things. What's the truest thing you've learned about yourself that was hidden, or something that was surprising?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say probably two things. One, this is why this I just clicked with me. I was operating my life out of a lot of fear. I had no idea. And I thought I was like very fearless. No, that was actually not true. I was just exceptionally determined. Now I know that I am quite fearless and determined now. I'm in a different space. So that, and then also, I came to realize that I really can do anything that I set my mind to. Like, I think those kind of correlate, but I really learned that through this process. And I really learned that, my purpose for being here is to turn all of my pain, not just the loss of my brother, but all of the pain I've been through in my life, into a purpose. That was a huge revelation for me too.
What would you say your overarching purpose is? You've got this amazing website. You offer a lot of different services. Yeah. What would you say your overarching purpose is at this point?
Yeah. So, it's kind of complex, but I know it's so aligned with your show, which is what I love. But the big 50,000 foot view is my purpose is to give people hope. It is to give people hope. I want to allow people to feel hope after loss. That is why I started the show. That's why I told my story. That's why I decided to be vulnerable. I didn't know that I could be this vulnerable. I used to think being vulnerable was being weak. It's the exact opposite. Vulnerability is strength. And I think that's another part of my purpose too, is that in sharing with everyone, but my other brand, MaYapinion, is really empowering women to be vulnerable and finding their strength within that, and finding what they really love to do and monetizing that, because you can love what you do and make money. So those are kind of all tied together. That's really my purpose in this world, and finding your purpose, it's life-changing. It's life-changing.
Yeah, I always say, when your purpose aligns with your passion, you make magic happen. Yep. So I know that we're coming to the top of the hour now, so we're going to wind us down with two questions that I always end my podcast with. I find that our sense of self-love really shifts after we go through the dark night of the soul. So my first question is, I want you to finish this sentence. We'll talk about self-love in a moment. Hope is...
Oh, that's a good one. Hope is feeling like you're not alone and being excited for the future. That's what I feel hope is. Mm-hmm.
Nice. Hope is feeling like you're not alone and did you say having hope for the future?
Yeah. Being excited for the future.
Excited. Thank you. Being excited for the future. I love that. So you had talked about you were living in fear. You thought you had it going on before your brother's death. You thought you had life all figured out and all wrapped up, but you discovered that, in fact, that might not have been so. Tell me what self-love looks like for you now. What does that mean?
Totally different than it did 6 years ago. So yeah, I mean, then it was like so superficial. It was like, do I look good? Am I the right weight? Am I like, do I have all these things? No, self-love now is, do I like who I am? Do I like who I am as a person? Am I good with who I am when I wake up in the morning? And when I lay my head down at night, do I like myself? Do I love myself? Do I love everything that I'm doing? Do I like the way that I treated Susan today? Do I like the way that I treated, Susie Q, Joe? Do I like what I gave to the world today? That's self-love, because that's a reflection of how I feel about myself. That's self-love to me.
What do you like most about yourself? Not love. What do you like most about yourself? Like when you say, all the things, what do you like most about Maya?
I don't like this. I love this about myself. I love the fact that I'm the most determined person you will ever meet. So I always say this, like, and this is a quote out there somewhere, and I'm so sorry. I don't know who said this, guys. You can,
It's okay. I do it all the time.
Figure it out for me. I have people quote me on this all the time. But, there's always going to be someone younger, smarter, faster, fill in the blank than you, right? But you can be the most determined person. And I learned that about myself at a very young age, that like, I don't give up. And I'm determined. And if I'm going to do something, I'm going to make it work. It might take me a little bit longer. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I might do it the hard way. As we noticed, I had to figure out grief the hard way, but I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to do something positive with it. And I don't just like that about myself. I love that about myself. So
I love that about you too. I love your energy. I love your vibe. I love the light that shines off you.
Thank you.
I want to say, okay, so people can find you at your website, Maya Roffler, ROFFLER.com. We will absolutely have all of this in the show notes. What about your Instagram? Is it same thing? Is it are you MaYapinion everywhere? Like, is that where people can find you?
Yeah, so I'll tell a couple things, and obviously I'm happy to shoot this over to you as well. So for your audience, because it's lost, they may want to go straight to our sibling website. So it's thesurvivingsiblings.com.
That will be in our show notes as well.
Yeah. Right on the website, we have all of the episodes. We have book resources, sponsors on there, where you can find groups, support. Everything I wish I had 6 years ago is there. We even launched today, which is super exciting. We launched our Zoom meetups that we're doing for support, peer-to-peer.
Great.
So lots of stuff there. But yeah, if you guys want to connect with me, I'm on Instagram all the time at Maya Roffler, also at Surviving Siblings Podcast. Same thing on TikTok. Those are my two that I go to, at Maya Roffler or at Surviving Siblings Podcast. I'm very active on both.
Perfect. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and sharing, and all of the things that you're doing in the world to support people. I want to thank my listeners. I love you guys. Thank you for showing up every week. Thank you for hanging on. And I hope today's conversation brought you a dose of hope and inspiration during your own journey. So thanks, guys. I'll see you here next week.